Hello, and welcome to Out West, the official podcast of the Western Governors Association. I'm Jack Waldorf, the Executive Director of WGA. In the wake of natural disasters, navigating complicated bureaucratic systems can be extremely challenging, especially for those living in historically underserved communities. Community navigators can help raise awareness about available resources and provide technical assistance when applying for grants or other government aid. In this episode of Out West, WGA Policy Advisor Jonah Seifer speaks with Meryl Harrell, the Deputy Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. They discuss the department's newly formed Community Navigators program and how it can help disseminate funds more equitably and efficiently. Jonah also spoke with Jonathan Bruno and Thérèse Ryley from Coalitions and Collaboratives, one of USDA's partners charged with enacting Community Navigators program on the ground.
Thanks, Jack. Our first guest today is Deputy Undersecretary Meryl Harrell, who helped create the Community Navigators program at USDA. The program helps arm communities with the resources and knowledge to navigate the complex web of administrative systems that often stand between those communities and federal assistance. In the first half of 2024 alone, Community Navigators reached more than 870 community members with training and technical assistance across more than 150 communities and organizations. Meryl, thank you so much for joining us. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Of course. So let's jump into it. Can you provide a little background and history of the Forest Service's Community Navigator program, where it came from and how it was developed?
We are very excited about this program. This is a new program that we have called the Community Navigator program. It is a pilot program funded through the Inflation Reduction Act. And the idea behind it is that to better serve our communities, we really need to think about how we can help communities better access resources and programs. So the Community Navigator program is really intended to be able to provide support for communities to better access Forest Services, resources, lands, technical assistance, programs, recognizing that it can often be really difficult to access federal programs. And there have historically been barriers and lack of capacity in communities to know how best to do that. So this program is really seeking to try and be better partners with communities, to understand their needs, to be more community-centric, and to help address some of those barriers to make it easier for them to get the resources they need.
So obviously this is an incredible opportunity, both for USDA as well as other federal agencies. I'm curious what the impetus behind the Community Navigators program. What was the catalyst or the event that really brought this into focus for you?
There were a few things. I think we've learned from some of the examples in other programs that being able to really support community vision and understand that need through providing capacity can make a really big difference. And we heard time and again from communities that one of their biggest barriers to being able to access federal programs and resources is that capacity. So we really wanted to take this opportunity to show up differently. We have partnership coordinators who do amazing work within the Forest Service. We have employees that have really deep relationships in communities. What we were hoping to do was to better support positions that are taking the approach of trying to understand the community's needs and that are grounded in the community and working from that direction back to say, what are the Forest Service lands, resources, programs, opportunities that aren't being realized? And how can we start building those relationships differently? We also know that there's oftentimes barriers that continually prevent communities from getting the access that they need. And so this is really an opportunity, and we were inspired by the need and the opportunity to really try and better understand what those barriers are from the community perspective and figure out how we can both address those barriers with that specific community, but then also learn at a system level. What can we be doing better? What can we be making easier? What is a continual constraint or a continual lack of good opportunity and relationship that may be happening in multiple places or multiple communities? And how can we be thinking about that differently? So that was really the inspiration. We have this amazing opportunity to really serve all communities, serve them differently, understand who's not getting access and why, and think about what is it that we can do to better orient and take a community-centric approach, support that capacity that's needed, and start to unlock those opportunities differently, both now and for the long term.
I think much like a lot of different federal programs, awareness is half the battle. How would you say most communities find out about the Community Navigator program or just learn about this resource that the agency offers?
Well, we are working on outreach, and we have some really great partners that are helping us with the Community Navigator program. The idea behind this program is that there are partners that have longstanding relationships and that are embedded in communities. And we are looking to find ways to better connect with those partners so that we can support capacity in the communities that we're trying to serve. So we have a number of partners that are our inaugural partners for the Community Navigator program. They include coalitions and collaboratives, the Watershed Research and Training Center, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, the Hispanic Access Foundation, the First Nations Development Institute, the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association. And we are also working with some of our other federal agencies that have similar programs to really be able to create a network of navigators who know federal resources and programs, know the Forest Service resources and programs, and can really help listen to what communities need and then help make those connections that are most impactful and useful. Because this pilot is funded through the Inflation Reduction Act, this initial set of outreach and engagement is really focused on helping communities understand what opportunities there are through the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, help identify that funding, help develop grant applications, think about the post-award support that's needed for organizations that have received support, and then just really help build community capacity and create networks that can have benefits into the future.
You mentioned that a lot of your partners are really embedded in communities, and that seems like a massive strategic advantage. What are the other strategic advantages of working with NGOs and other partners to deliver Community Navigator services?
Well, we've really seen this work in other programs. There have been examples through, for example, the Recreation Economy for Rural Communities program, the Sentinel Landscapes program, the Urban Federal Waters Partnership program, where we've really seen the power of a community-based navigator, ambassador, connector to really help unlock access differently to federal programs, resources, technical assistance, lands, all the things that we want to make sure people have access to. So those examples really helped us think about how to structure this program so that we had capacity within the agency, as well as connect with those organizations that are rooted in community and have those relationships and networks. With the idea being that having both of those sets of capacity can really help clear barriers and identify paths forward so that on the community side and the partner side, there's a way to access the community leaders, there's trusted relationships, there's that really locally based understanding of what's truly needed so that it's not, a federal partner coming in and saying, here's what we have, but more listening to understand what's needed and then try and best match what's available with the needs that a community is saying that they have, and to be able to remove barriers that communities often have to be able to access those barriers. So the idea is to really be able to elevate the opportunity to have this shared knowledge and to better match resources and programs and opportunities across the board. We also have heard so often from communities that one of the biggest challenges is just simply capacity. We know folks in communities are often doing 3 or 4 or 5 jobs and trying to manage a lot of different things and trying at the same time to understand and navigate multiple different agencies, programs, and all that comes with that, and know what's coming out at any given time or is available at any given time or who to call. All of that can be a challenge and a barrier. So the idea with the Community Navigators program is that we can help mitigate some of those barriers, both for specific communities, and then also better understand what barriers continually replicate themselves across the system and learn from that so that we can get better as an agency and as a department in figuring out ways to make it easier for communities to get the help they need and to access the resources and programs and lands that we can help make available.
I can imagine they really help the acceptance on the ground, really. I mean, there's a notion, I think, in certain parts of the West, at least, where if somebody shows up and says, "I'm from the federal government, I'm here to help," they might get some funny looks. But someone that's truly viewed as, one of us, so to speak, a member of the community, I can really sense the power that has, that some folks believe they're really going to be getting the help they need rather than whatever their prior experience with the federal government may have been.
Right. And that the person who's in this role is taking a community-centric approach. It's not about presenting, your own ideas, but it's really about better listening and understanding to what the community's needs are, and then thinking about how to connect that to the resources that may be available. And in this case, in particular, opportunities that may be available through the Inflation Reduction Act and bipartisan infrastructure law, but more broadly as a concept, thinking about switching that approach to be much more community-centered and focused, and to understand that in order to do that, it often does take that capacity, that person who is a champion and who knows who to call, when to call, what information is needed in order to be able to get access to grants or resources or programs, and at the right time. How can we make it easier for communities that haven't had that experience or don't have that capacity to begin with, to build that capacity, to make those connections, to be supported in applying for programs that are available, and supported in implementing any awards that they get, to build that capacity and that fluency and those relationships over time that can then translate to future needs and can translate to unlocking more and more opportunities. I think we often see that there's a cascading wave of opportunity that comes from starting to unlock these doors and build these relationships, because then you can call that person that you've just sat across the table from and ask if they know if anything is going to be coming available, or if they know somebody who can help with a different aspect of the challenge or the need. And oftentimes they do. So starting to open those doors and unlock that access can then build on itself. I also think the more we have people in the Community Navigator program and role, the more familiar they're going to get with all of the different opportunities. And we're going to be building those relationships over time, so that if somebody who served in a Community Navigator role then becomes a program manager for a partner organization or a nonprofit organization, or within the Forest Service, if that Community Navigator then becomes the partnership coordinator or the grants and agreement specialist or the district ranger, then you have this network of individuals who are coming from that community-centered approach and really have those relationships and have a better sense of where barriers can appear in the system and how to think about that ahead of time.
I like that idea that the answer to cascading disasters is setting up a system that enables cascading opportunities. I'm thinking a bit about limiting factors to success. Obviously, greater resources is always helpful. What other sort of limiting factors do you see within this program, or perhaps just the larger system of federal assistance?
I do think support for that capacity is important, and programs aren't always resourced to be able to provide that human capacity, the person who's going to help make those connections and bring a community-centered approach and really be able to be present and listen and understand, and then help make things work. So having funding for and support for capacities is just really important. We're hearing that more and more often. It's also really helpful for that capacity to be funded on a multi-year basis. We have provided support through our partners for community navigators for more than 1 year. And that really helps because it takes time to build relationships. And that's why it's also really helpful to have partners that are rooted in community. but having time to be able to see things through and be able to follow a process from, for example, grant application to, if successful, receipt of a grant and then support for implementation. We're seeing that, for example, in some of the community wildfire defense grant work that our community navigators have been doing. That's really helpful to have that time to really continue to see things through and make sure that those doors are being opened and that access is realized.
Yeah, I can imagine that the multi-year support is really orders of magnitude more powerful than a short-term ad hoc approach to this. This is currently being funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. How long is that funding stream realistically going to last for, and what steps really are needed to make this a more permanent fixture?
We're thinking about that. Our community navigators are funded for this work through mid 2026. And we are thinking from there, how do we integrate the ability to have similar support through our regular programs of work, recognizing that this is a pilot that will help demonstrate what's needed and what is successful in terms of unlocking different access to resources, lands, technical assistance programs that will have relevant learning for our programs writ large. And we're thinking ahead to how we can anticipate a different way of supporting the Community Navigator program into the future. It's also got great support and partnership from others. We know that this is of interest to many partners who are thinking about how to better support communities. So we're hoping to continue to be able to build relationships and partnerships across the board.
Great. Well, I certainly hope that the program continues to receive the support that it clearly deserves. What does disaster recovery really look like without the Community Navigators program? I mean, what's at stake here?
We see when a community has experienced disaster that that's often the worst time to try and figure out programs that you're not familiar with, and try and make connections and navigate a very complex environment with multiple agencies that are needed to support that post-disaster environment. If we, through a community navigator program, can help support communities and make it easier, that matters. That takes out some of the stress. Communities are often, in extreme situations. People are displaced. They're trying to just figure out basic necessities. How can we work together to try and address multiple needs that communities have?
Deputy Undersecretary Harrell, I'm excited to see the impact this has both at the systemic and the community level, and really appreciate you taking the time this morning to share more about the program with us. Thank you.
Thank you for having me and for your attention to what communities need. It's appreciated. We appreciate our partnership.
For a local perspective, I'm pleased to welcome Jonathan Bruno and Thérèse Ryley of Coalitions and Collaboratives to the show. As one of the Forest Service's inaugural partners in their Community Navigators program, Coalitions and Collaboratives works on the ground to implement these navigator services. Thérèse and Jonathan, thank you so much for being here. Let's jump right in to talk about Coalitions and Collaboratives' Community Navigators program. There have historically been some barriers for certain communities to access federal programs. What barriers do you see replicate themselves most often on the ground?
So I would say initially, or maybe most narrowly, we're talking about accessing federal funding, but we know that our communities working in, our community-based organizations working in frontline communities are wearing a lot of hats and have a lot of capacity needs. And so we see issues with capacity, organizational capacity, and the ability to really develop programs to then be able to apply for federal funding. So we really work to not only provide support to access federal funding, but to provide additional capacity to frontline community serving organizations and provide support with program development to meet the needs of communities.
Yeah, I'll just follow up. So thinking about these barriers, when I think about access to federal program, and how we really look at this challenge of getting resources to local communities across the country. it's really important to think about what are the causes, what are the symptoms. And so I spent a lot of time really trying to understand, when we look at barriers to access, that we try to figure out not just sort of like, is it a grant application? Is it awareness about this grant program that's available? Is it access to the agency? Is it awareness that, frankly, the agency even exists? And I really try to, we as an organization at Coalitions and Collaboratives really try to understand what is the cause of those symptoms. And so I feel like oftentimes we oversimplify the barrier. So we say, oh, well, they're not successfully receiving grant applications. But really what oftentimes we're talking about is the governance structures, the systems that are in place to support the organizations to effectively access and receive the funding. And we really look at addressing the causes versus just the symptoms. And I'll be really honest that organizations can access funding. Even the most financially stable organizations can really get funding. However, developing long-term sustainable resources, well, that's the real challenge that a lot of communities are facing.
You both touched on some structural barriers as well as the root causes of those barriers. I'm curious what strategies you've employed to address these things in the field.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that first. I think let's get back to basics. Really, one of the most critical elements to our work and the way that we're approaching this is looking at building trusting, sustainable relationships. And so the reality is, if we have billions of dollars available, millions of dollars available in some cases, that means nothing if the recipient of the funding doesn't know it exists, or frankly doesn't trust the entity that has the funding. And vice versa. If the agencies or the organization that has the funding available doesn't truly trust or even frankly understand the community that they're trying to serve, well, we're going to run into a huge issue. And so our strategy really starts from some very, very simple sort of foundational concepts. One is we have to build trusting relationships by working very closely with the individual communities and the risks and the hazards that potentially they face. And to do that, we have to start from a place of listening, not assuming that we know what those challenges are, or what the histories and the context of that situation is. And so really making sure that we're taking the time to understand local context and then building those trusting partnerships. And sometimes it's as easy as making a connection. It's bringing two organizations together. It's asking the hard questions. Who's not in the room? Why are they missing? And let's invite them to have this conversation. And those are really some of sort of the higher level strategies. And I think Tess can share some of those finer tactical approaches that we use.
Yeah, so I'd say those like tactical strategies that we use are really two-pronged, and one is community facing and one is agency facing. Community facing is really working one-on-one with communities. We have a team of navigators who really work one-on-one with communities to work through those federal forms and the jargon in those forms to provide grant writing support and understanding how to interpret some of the questions that our federal agency partners are asking in grant applications or the development of an agreement with the Forest Service or another federal agency. And so that's really working hand in hand with communities to really navigate challenging systems. And that's kind of a short-term strategy that we take. A long-term strategy that we're taking, and this is working really closely with the Forest Service Steering Committee that oversees the Navigator initiative on the Forest Service side, is really collecting the barriers that us, our organization, and the other implementation partners that are working with communities on the ground are identifying, and the Forest Service is really doing a very diligent job in working to see how they can do some internal systems change to remove those barriers in the long term. So I think this has been a really successful approach so far, both seeing communities learn how to navigate a lot of these challenging structures. And also it's really wonderful to see how diligent our Forest Service Steering Committee is working at removing those barriers internally.
You both started off by talking about really trust and relationships being the keystone of this work. I'm wondering, is there really any other way? I mean, is the community-centric approach the essential strategy to being successful in this work?
I don't think we have another choice, and the reason I say that is that we're all, to the listeners out there, I mean, you all are from a place, whether it's families, friends, economies. You have these systems that connect you to that place, and I think when we as an organization and as a member of this society and the communities that we serve, it's having this really close connection to place and to the people that we depend upon is so important. And so for us, there's no other answer. There's no other way to do this. Top down approaches lead to alienation, lead to folks that potentially aren't served, lead to assumptions and biases that far too often are embedded in our actions. Whereas if we really start from the ground up and we start from that place of listening and really understanding what makes a community thrive, how they work together, what their collective histories and trust is and what it's built upon, if we start from there, you build a really strong structure. And so I always say that everything is local. Everything is, at the end of the day, who are the people that will, lose the most or gain the most? And I think we could look to the fires in California and say, who's going to carry the burden? Who's going to have the trauma? And it's going to be our responders. It's going to be our residents. And ultimately, it will be our politicians and our leadership that are trying to answer these questions. But oftentimes, they're answering it from Washington, D.C. or from somewhere else. And so our focus within the Navigator approach, navigation is embedded in everything we do. It has to be. And so we have to look at this and say, how do we understand a community and then how do we respond? And so assessing a community and then coming from that place is going to be essential for us to address these complex issues that we face. And at the end of the day, the folks in California are going to be the ones that are picking up the pieces. And yes, they will lean towards our agencies and our governments to help to provide them with the financial resources. But if they don't have the skills, the tools, the tactics, and the strategies in hand, success is going to be hard to attain.
Yeah, I like that notion that the connection to place really drives the success of it. I want to try to bring this into focus a little more. Are there any specific case studies that you can share that jump out at you, either stories of success that would help our listeners really understand the value that navigation brings to communities, or alternatively, instances where some of those structural barriers and root causes were actually a lot more challenging to address, maybe because of those place-specific considerations?
I'm glad you asked this question, Jonah, because I think we can really go on all day talking about a lot of the successes that we've had with the Navigator initiative. So I can share one recent success was that the Wood Innovations competitive grant program of the U.S. Forest Service, they had a round that ended in December, and they saw 150% increase in applications, and they've credited to the Navigator initiative. And I can also share that we had a 67% success rate with the support that we provided to organizations who applied for the American Forest pass-through grant, their Catalyst Fund. And the organizations we supported have received the maximum award that they requested and also that they could ask for. I want to highlight that a lot of these federal grant programs are so impactful when they can be implemented, but with the nature of all that is required for these applications, even if you have a really skilled grant writer on your team, oftentimes there's up to 5 people working on that application to really make sure that it is robust enough to be competitive. And so we've worked with some really incredible organizations who are doing really great work and also have talented grant writers, but we want them to be able to focus on the work that they're providing on the ground and be able to step in and support those competitive application processes and ensure that they're successful, which, like I said, we have. So those are some really I would say qualitative successes, but we have a lot of quantitative successes too. One example in the San Luis Valley in Colorado, this is in southern Colorado, they have had a wildfire council for a couple of years, but because all of the participants in that council have day jobs, right? It's an added thing to everyone's work. Our Community Navigator Initiative fellow, Jedediah Lomax, has stepped in as a facilitator for the Wildfire Council, and they've really been able to move those meetings from just updates about happenings related to wildfire mitigation throughout the San Luis Valley to really moving forward with some strategic planning, potentially turning the Wildfire Council into a 501c3. And it really took the capacity support that our fellow provided.
Yeah, Tess, as you were speaking, I kept thinking about this concept of, the inherent within the name navigation, a tour guide, not handouts, but a handshake. And I keep thinking about translation. Oftentimes when we speak about these really complex federal systems and programs, it does take a dictionary to understand the acronyms, to understand the timelines, to know who and how funding is accessed and who to speak with. And there is this barrier of entry. And so I do believe that, having the ability for the navigators to have been there, done that, and I don't mean to be cliche as I say that, but a lot of the experiences that Tess highlighted as examples, and a lot of I call it the school of hard knocks. It's been hard. It is really challenging, and our federal partners are amazing and support this work in these places. But to really be thoughtful about how we help communities directly to navigate these really complex systems. I think about some examples. When we speak to directly supporting and seeing our quantitative and qualitative outcomes, I care about making sure that the organizations that they have the systems in place to be even eligible, whether they receive funding under this or that grant program, making sure that the entity that really has this amazing mission, the passion, they've been doing work for their place, whether it be putting prescribed fire on the ground or hardening homes or other wildfire types of related activities, if they don't have the correct insurance coverage, they're not going to get anywhere. If they don't have the systems in place to manage federal funding, and that's having a budgeting system. And so we've supported organizations developing the internal governance structures that are necessary, whether that be developing travel and procurement policies or bylaws. And so it runs this full gamut, really making sure that organizations start with the right foot forward.
So we've talked about the history of work for the community navigators, the way that the program has learned and changed over time. I'm curious to hear from you both. How would you like to see the community navigators change in the future?
Yeah, that's really, really important. And I think that for us as an organization, first, I just want to take the time, Jonah and team, to thank you all for having this really critical conversation. And I'll say that's part of my answer. Let's keep having the discourse. Let's make sure that we create the space to have open, honest, and critical dialogue, to not talk about the person, but talk about the problem. How do we solve for this? I think that we're all faced with really unique challenges as we move forward. I think that the past years have really taught us that to overcome, we must bring together our resources, bring together our expertise, and do things differently. And so as we look at this community navigators movement, one of the things that COCO is really focusing in on is embedding the concepts into all of our work, meaning that as we're addressing more and more fire, I believe that last year, 2024, was the hottest on record. Whether we agree or not, the reality is, as a 27-year veteran in fire, I've responded to and heard of more fires and more fires over my career. And I think it's really critical that we look to that future and say, well, how do we respond to it? We can sit back and watch, or we can take really strategic, proactive actions to prepare for this future that frankly is, and this is totally trite and cliche, is like, it's the normal. This is our reality. It's not unprecedented anymore. It's not unheard of. communities burning down thousands and thousands of homes. And so we have to come at it and say, okay, we know this will happen. What are the actions that we can take? And so as an organization, we're trying to embed concepts of community navigation into everything we do, making sure that everyone has an opportunity, everyone's voice is heard, that we're developing the systems necessary to get the funding to the ground, to the places that need it most, and that we're asking ourselves and looking around the room and really making sure that if people aren't in the room, we take the time to understand why. And I'll tell you, at times that means we might have to step out of the way and allow for other organizations, other entities to stand up. And so, that's really where we're looking. And I know Tess is also thinking about what's next for us. So I'd love to hear, Tess, where you're thinking as well.
Yeah, I think kind of touching on Jonathan's answer, a way that I would like to see the Navigator initiative change, and I don't even know that I'd necessarily say change, but grow over time, is to really broaden our understanding and focus of how communities are impacted by environmental stressors, the disasters that they experience, like wildfire, like flooding. Jonathan mentioned the impact that a catastrophic fire could have on a low capacity community, and that in turn has impacts on those community members' health, on job security, other forms of economic security. And I'd really like to see deeper integration across our federal agencies, as well as the Navigator partners, Navigator community-based organization partners as well, so that we can continue to provide more and more holistic support to the communities that we're working with. I also think that there's these mechanisms baked into federal agency systems for accessing funding that create additional barriers for organizations that haven't historically had relationships with our federal agency partners. And that is essentially to kind of build a relationship over time and show that organization can maintain compliance with those federal agency regulations and things like that. But I would really like to see changes to that process, because a lot of the communities that we're working with are the best communities to really infuse funding towards. And there is this kind of skepticism baked into those systems of those communities because they don't have a previous relationship with our agency partners. And so I'd really like to see a lot of these barriers that we've been identifying internal to our agency partners really shift and change to better be able to provide swifter resourcing to our frontline communities.
I think that's a great synopsis of how coalitions and collaboratives can adapt so that communities can adapt too. Jonathan, Thérèse, I want to thank you for joining us on our podcast today. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much for having us, Jonah.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Out West, presented by Western Governors Association. To learn more about our ongoing work to mitigate the effects of catastrophic wildfire, please visit westgov.org. And be sure to join us next time as we continue to discuss significant issues facing the Western United States. Finally, WGA would like to thank Undersecretary Harrell, Jonathan Bruno, and Thérèse Ryley for sharing their expertise with us. Until next time, we'll see you out west.